There are families, and then there are legends, dynasties of such staggering eccentricity, brilliance, and controversy that their story seems less like history and more like a grand, sprawling, and often unbelievable novel. The Mitfords were one such family. To utter their name in England is to conjure a whirlwind of associations: glamour, wit, and literary genius on one hand, scandal, political extremism, and heartbreaking tragedy on the other. They were the beautiful, doomed swans of the English aristocracy, a tribe of 6 sisters and 1 brother who between them managed to captivate, delight, and horrify the 20th century. At the heart of this extraordinary clan, acting as its chief chronicler, its sharpest observer, and its most devastating satirist, was the eldest sister, Nancy. While her more infamous siblings, Diana and Unity, were grabbing headlines for their dalliances with fascism and their chilling proximity to Europe's most monstrous dictators, Nancy was quietly sharpening her pen, turning the absurd, rarefied world of her upbringing into pure literary gold. She was a woman born into a gilded cage, a world of inherited titles and unheated country houses, who used her intellect and a rapier wit to not only escape but to dissect and immortalize the very world that sought to define her. But behind the sparkling prose and the laugh-out-loud social commentary lies a story of profound personal pain, of deep love and devastating heartbreak, of navigating a family torn apart by the most toxic ideologies of the age. Hers is a story of a woman constantly searching for her place, both within her chaotic family and in a world that was changing faster than the aristocracy could comprehend. To understand Nancy Mitford is to understand the last gasps of a dying world, and to witness the birth of a voice so unique, so piercingly funny, and so deeply human that it continues to enchant us today. This is the story of the woman who held a mirror up to the English upper class and made them laugh at their own ridiculous reflection, all while nursing a heart full of secrets. To truly grasp the world that forged Nancy Mitford, we must first step back in time, into the strange, insulated, and deeply contradictory universe of the English aristocracy in the early 20th century. This was a class at the absolute zenith of its power, governing a global empire upon which the sun never set, yet simultaneously riddled with a deep-seated anxiety about its own survival. The Edwardian era, with its opulent house parties and rigid certainties, was fading into memory, and the seismic shock of the First World War was about to shatter its foundations forever. Nancy was born in 1904 into a world where your surname and your country estate were your entire identity. Life for families like the Mitfords revolved not around the bustling, modernizing cities, but around vast, isolated houses in the countryside. These were not just homes, they were self-contained kingdoms with their own rules, their own traditions, and their own cast of characters, from the family upstairs to the army of servants downstairs. It was a life of immense privilege, but also one of profound isolation. Children were raised by nannies and governesses, seeing their parents for perhaps an hour a day. This emotional distance, a hallmark of the upper-class upbringing, bred a peculiar kind of self-reliance and an intense, often suffocating reliance on one's siblings for companionship and affection. The patriarch of this world was Nancy's father, David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, the second Baron Redesdale. Known to his children as Favre, he was a character straight out of a novel, a towering, handsome man of immense charm and even more immense, unpredictable rages. He was a man of deeply entrenched prejudices, hating all foreigners, with a passion, suspicious of education, especially for women, and believing that the world had been going downhill since the 18th century. Having been traumatically wounded in the Boer War and again in the Great War, he carried the scars of conflict with him, which often manifested in a short temper and a bellowing voice that could terrify his children. Yet beneath the bluster was a deeply sentimental man who loved the countryside and his family, even if he had no idea how to relate to them. His wife, Sidney Bowles, or Muv, was his perfect, placid counterpart. She was a famously beautiful woman, but her defining characteristic was a serene, almost otherworldly detachment from the chaos that swirled around her. While Favre raged, Muv would calmly continue with her knitting or her accounts. Her passions were not social or intellectual. They were for her prize-winning chickens and the small profit she made from selling their eggs. She was notoriously frugal, believing that heating the vast, drafty family homes was an unnecessary extravagance, forcing her children to spend winters huddled for warmth in a single airing cupboard they nicknamed the Hones cupboard, short for Honorable's cupboard. She was not an unkind mother, but she was an emotionally absent one, viewing her brood of 7 children with a sort of bemused impersonal affection, as if they were a particularly interesting flock of birds. This was the environment into which Nancy and her siblings were thrown. A world of aristocratic grandeur mixed with Spartan discomfort, ruled by a furious father and a distant mother. With no real parental guidance and a deep suspicion of formal education, the Mitford children were left to raise themselves. They created their own private world, complete with a secret language filled with nicknames and in-jokes, a dialect they called boodledidge. They didn't just have friends, they had allies and enemies within their own ranks. They were a tribe, fiercely loyal to one another against the outside world, but engaged in constant, often vicious, internal warfare. Nancy, as the eldest, bore the brunt of this strange upbringing. She was born with a sharp, inquisitive mind and a desperate hunger for knowledge and experience, but her father firmly believed that education was wasted on girls. His sole ambition for his daughters was that they marry well, preferably to a neighboring landowner with a large estate. While their brother Tom was sent off to Eton, the most prestigious school in England, Nancy and her sisters were left in the schoolroom at their Oxfordshire home, Asthall Manor, and later Swinbrook House, at the mercy of a string of hapless governesses who rarely lasted long against the combined psychological warfare of the Mitford girls. So, Nancy educated herself. She became a voracious reader, devouring every book she could find in her father's library, from scandalous French novels to dense histories. This self-directed, haphazard education gave her a vast and eclectic range of knowledge, but also left her with lifelong insecurities about her lack of formal credentials. Writing became her escape, her way of processing the bizarre reality of her family life. From a young age, she scribbled stories and plays, casting her siblings in thinly veiled roles, and already displaying the nascent wit that would become her trademark. Her childhood was a study in contrasts. On one hand, there were the endless, idyllic summers spent roaming the Oxfordshire countryside, riding ponies, and indulging in elaborate, imaginative games. On the other, there was the constant low-level tension of Favre's temper, the emotional chill from Muv, and the gnawing frustration of a brilliant mind being told its only purpose was to find a husband. This unique cocktail of freedom and restriction, of love and neglect, of high comedy and quiet desperation, was the fertile soil from which the novelist Nancy Mitford would grow. It gave her the material for a lifetime of work, and the psychological armor, her sharp, glittering wit, that she would need to survive it all. As Nancy emerged from the cocoon of her eccentric childhood and into the roaring 20s, she was catapulted into the dizzying social whirl of the London season. This was the annual ritual where the daughters of the aristocracy were formally presented at court and launched onto the marriage market through a relentless series of debutante balls, dinner parties, and country house weekends. For a girl like Nancy, who was not a conventional beauty and was more interested in books than in hunting, it was a daunting prospect. Yet, it was also her first taste of real freedom and her introduction to a set of people who would shape her life and her art, the bright young things. This was a generation scarred by the Great War, determined to throw off the staid conventions of their Victorian and Edwardian parents. They were a glamorous, fast-living, and often scandalous group of young aristocrats and bohemians who shocked polite society with their wild treasure hunts through London, their themed fancy dress parties, and their flagrant disregard for the old rules. Nancy, with her sharp wit and craving for excitement, was immediately drawn into their orbit. She became a fixture in this world and a close friend to many of its leading lights, including the brilliant acerbic novelist Evelyn Waugh, the photographer Cecil Beaton, and the poet John Betjeman. This was her university. It was here that she truly honed her observational skills, listening to the gossips, studying the nuances of social climbing, and absorbing the particular cadence of upper-class speech, all of which would later be reproduced with uncanny accuracy in her novels. But while her social life was flourishing, her romantic life was a source of profound and prolonged agony. She fell deeply, desperately in love with Hamish St. Clair Erskine, the handsome, charming, and impossibly beautiful son of the Earl of Rosslyn. Hamish was the epitome of the dazzling but emotionally unavailable aesthete. He was witty, artistic, and utterly captivating, but also notoriously fickle and terrified of commitment. For years, Nancy was caught in a torturous on-again, off-again engagement with him. He would propose, she would ecstatically accept, and then he would get cold feet and vanish, leaving her heartbroken and publicly humiliated. This was not a private sorrow. In their small, gossipy world, everyone knew about Nancy's plight. The relationship became a long-running joke among their friends, a source of endless speculation and pity. For Nancy, it was a searing, formative experience of unrequited love. Her letters from this period are filled with a raw and painful vulnerability that stands in stark contrast to her witty, composed public persona. She wrote of her despair, her jealousy, and her desperate, futile attempts to change herself to please him. This prolonged heartbreak didn't just shape her emotionally, it shaped her as a writer. She poured all her frustrations and observations into her first novels, Highland Fling, 1931, and Christmas Pudding, 1932. These early works, while full of the witty dialogue and social satire that would become her signature, are also tinged with a youthful cynicism and a certain bitterness born of her romantic disappointments. The character of the clever, observant, but often overlooked and unlucky in love young woman became a recurring figure in her work, a fictionalized echo of her own painful experiences on the merciless London marriage market. Finally, after years of emotional turmoil, the engagement to Hamish was definitively broken. The experience left Nancy wounded, but also hardened. It taught her a valuable, if painful, lesson about the unreliability of romantic love and the necessity of forging her own path. She resolved to become a serious writer, to make a name for herself not as someone's wife, but as an artist in her own right. It was in this state of mind, emotionally bruised but determined, that she met Peter Rod in 1933. Rod, known as Prod, seemed at first to be everything Hamish was not. He was fiercely intelligent, politically engaged, and seemed to take her seriously. He was also charming, handsome, and came from a good family. After the years of uncertainty with Hamish, Peter's decisive courtship was a balm to her wounded pride. They were married within the year. Nancy believed she had finally found her happy ending. She was, however, tragically mistaken. The marriage that she hoped would bring her stability and happiness would instead prove to be another long and difficult chapter, one marked by infidelity, financial chaos, and the growing terrifying shadow of political extremism that was beginning to fall not just over Europe, but over her own family. Nancy Mitford's marriage to Peter Rod in 1933 was, on the surface, a step into a more serious and stable world. After the emotional roller coaster with the ephemeral Hamish St. Clair Erskine, Peter, with his sharp intellect and passionate political convictions, seemed to offer the substance she craved. He was a man of action and ideas, a stark contrast to the languid aesthetes of her previous circle. Nancy threw herself into the role of wife with characteristic energy, setting up their home and trying to create a life that was both intellectually stimulating and domestically sound. She believed, with the fierce optimism of someone who has known deep disappointment, that she had finally found her partner, a man who saw her not just as a witty debutante, but as an equal. The illusion, however, began to crumble with alarming speed. The reality of being married to Peter Rod was far from the intellectual salon she had envisioned. While undeniably brilliant, Peter was also profoundly restless, arrogant, and almost pathologically incapable of settling down. He was a man possessed by a series of fleeting, intense enthusiasms, none of which ever translated into a steady income or a stable career. One moment he was a fervent supporter of some obscure political cause. The next he was off on a harebrained scheme to travel across the globe with little money and even less of a plan. He was, as one friend wryly noted, always on the verge of a great career. Their life together quickly descended into a state of genteel but chronic poverty. Peter's family had money, but he was consistently at odds with them, and his own ventures rarely paid off. Nancy, who had grown up in a world of vast, if unheated houses, now found herself constantly worrying about bills, moving from one rented flat to another, and trying to stretch the small income she was beginning to make from her writing. Peter, meanwhile, remained blithely unconcerned with such mundane matters. He was a man who believed his brilliance entitled him to a life free from the dreary constraints of financial responsibility. Worse than the financial instability was the emotional neglect. Peter was frequently absent, off on his travels or pursuing his latest political obsession. When he was home, he could be a difficult and domineering companion, prone to long lecturing monologues and dismissive of Nancy's own intellectual pursuits. He was also, as she soon discovered, a serial philanderer. The marriage she had hoped would be a partnership of equals became a lonely and disillusioning experience. She was left to manage their chaotic finances, deal with landlords, and wait for a husband who was more interested in saving the world than in building a life with her. This slow, grinding disappointment was a new kind of heartbreak, less dramatic than the saga with Hamish, but in many ways more corrosive. It was the death of a dream, the realization that she had exchanged one form of unhappiness for another. While Nancy was grappling with the dreary realities of her failing marriage, a far more sinister and dramatic storm was gathering within her own family. The 1930s was a decade of ideological fervor, a time when the certainties of the old world had collapsed, leaving a vacuum that was filled by the seductive and dangerous promises of fascism and communism. And the Mitford sisters, with their passionate natures and unconventional upbringing, threw themselves into the heart of this conflict with a terrifying lack of reservation. They didn't just adopt political views, they embodied them, turning their family into a living, breathing microcosm of a Europe on the brink of self-destruction. The first to make a decisive and shocking leap was Diana. Widely considered the most beautiful and intelligent of the sisters, she had made a perfect aristocratic match, marrying the handsome and fabulously wealthy brewing heir, Brian Guinness. She was the mistress of 2 grand houses, a celebrated society hostess, and a mother to 2 young sons. She had everything a woman of her class was supposed to want. But Diana was bored. She found the conventional life of the aristocracy stifling and intellectually vapid. She craved passion, purpose, and a cause that felt larger than herself. She found it in the charismatic and dangerous figure of Sir Oswald Mosley. Mosley was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, a magnetic, powerful speaker who promised a new, dynamic future for a Britain he saw as decadent and in decline. Diana was utterly captivated by his vision and by the man himself. In a move that scandalized society, she left her husband and her comfortable life to become Mosley's mistress, and eventually his second wife. This was not a casual affair. It was an ideological conversion. Diana became a true believer, deeply committed to the fascist cause. She saw Mosley not as a proto-dictator, but as a misunderstood patriot, and she willingly followed him into the darkest corners of European politics. Together, they made frequent trips to Nazi Germany, where they were welcomed as honored guests by Adolf Hitler himself. Diana's letters and diaries from the time reveal a woman who was not merely impressed but genuinely charmed by the Führer. She saw him as a man of immense power and vision, and she seemed willfully blind to the brutality and vicious anti-Semitism at the core of his regime. In 1936, she and Mosley were secretly married in Berlin in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. The guest of honor at this small private ceremony was Adolf Hitler. The beautiful, brilliant Mitford girl had crossed a line, irrevocably tying her name and her fate to the most reviled regime in modern history. If Diana's journey into fascism was a calculated intellectual one, her younger sister Unity's was a story of pure, unadulterated obsession. Unity, known to the family as Bobo, was a tall, striking, but deeply insecure young woman, desperate to make her mark on the world. She found her life's purpose in the cult of Nazism. Her fascination with Hitler began as a schoolgirl crush and metastasized into a fanatical, all-consuming devotion. In 1934, at the age of 20, she moved to Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi movement, with the singular goal of meeting her idol. Her methods were relentless. She learned German and immersed herself in Nazi ideology. She discovered Hitler's favorite restaurant, the Osteria Bavaria, and went there every single day, sitting at a table where he could not fail to notice her. For months he ignored her, but eventually her persistence paid off. Intrigued by this tall, blonde, and fanatically devoted English aristocrat, Hitler invited her to his table. It was the beginning of one of the strangest relationships of the 20th century. Unity became a fixture in Hitler's inner circle. She was not a political strategist like Diana. She was a court favorite, a kind of Nazi mascot. Hitler was reportedly fascinated by her connections to the British aristocracy and her uncritical adoration. For Unity, this was the validation she had always craved. She was no longer just one of the Mitford sisters. She was a friend of the Führer. She filled her Munich apartment with Nazi flags and signed photographs of Hitler. She gave the Heil Hitler salute with gusto and spouted anti-Semitic rhetoric she had picked up from Julius Streicher's vile newspaper, Der Stürmer. She was living in a fantasy world, completely blind to the monstrous reality of the regime she so admired. She wrote to her family with breathless excitement about her meetings with Hitler, seemingly oblivious to the horror and alarm her letters were causing back in England. As if to provide a perfect dramatic counterbalance to her fascist sisters, Jessica, the second youngest known as Decca, veered violently in the opposite political direction. A natural rebel from a young age, Decca found the traditions and expectations of her aristocratic background utterly suffocating. While Diana and Unity were drawn to the rigid order and nationalist fervor of fascism, Decca was drawn to the revolutionary promise of communism. She saw it as the ultimate act of rebellion against her family and her class. In her bedroom, she used a diamond ring to scratch hammers and sickles onto the window panes. She hoarded her savings, and at the age of 19, eloped to Spain with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, Winston Churchill's rebellious young nephew, and a fellow communist. Their plan was to fight for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. The elopement caused an uproar. Favre was incandescent with rage, viewing Decca's actions as the ultimate betrayal. He and Mauve pursued the couple across Europe, and the British government even sent a warship to try and bring them home, all to no avail. Decca had made her choice. She had severed ties with her family and her past, dedicating her life to a cause that was the polar opposite of the one her sisters had embraced. Nancy, stranded in the middle of this ideological minefield, watched it all unfold with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a kind of grim satirical detachment. It was the ultimate tragic Mitford drama, and she was its unwilling audience. Her letters from the period reveal a woman struggling to comprehend how the sisters she had grown up with, the girls she had shared secrets and jokes with in the Hans cupboard, could have become such passionate and dangerous extremists. She once famously described her family as being composed of herself and Decca as bookends, leaning in from opposite sides to hold up the tottering middle, which included the fascist sisters. The family gatherings at Swinbrook became tense, surreal affairs. Imagine a dinner table where a communist, two fascists, and their apoplectic conservative father are all trying to have a civil conversation. Arguments would inevitably erupt, with Unity passionately defending Hitler while Decca denounced him as a monster, and Favre, who despite his own anti-Semitic and right-wing views thought Hitler was a vulgar upstart, would bellow for everyone to be quiet. Nancy, ever the observer, would sit through these scenes, storing up the absurd and terrifying details. Her response to her family's political madness was to do what she always did. She wrote about it. In 1935, she published Whigs on the Green, a light, satirical novel that mercilessly lampooned Oswald Mosley and his fascist followers, the Black Shirts. The novel featured a preposterous demagogue named Captain Jack, whose followers were called the Union Jack Shirts, and a beautiful but dim-witted aristocratic girl who becomes obsessed with him. The parallels were unmistakable. The book was Nancy's public disavowal of her sister's politics, a brave and risky move that put her in direct opposition to Diana and Unity. The fascist sisters were furious, seeing it as a profound act of family betrayal. A painful rift opened between them, one that would take years to heal. For Nancy, it was a necessary act of moral clarity. She was using her only weapon, her wit, to fight back against the darkness that was threatening to consume her family. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 was the moment the political games turned deadly real. The ideological chasm that had split the Mitford family now mirrored the conflict that was tearing Europe apart. For each of the sisters, the war brought a moment of devastating crisis. For Unity, the declaration of war between Britain, the country of her birth, and Germany, the country of her obsession, was an unbearable catastrophe. Her fantasy world, in which her two great loves could coexist, came crashing down. On September 3, 1939, the day Britain declared war, She went to the English Garden in Munich, took out a pearl-handled pistol that Hitler had given her for protection, and shot herself in the head. Miraculously, she survived. The bullet lodged in her brain, but it did not kill her. Hitler, upon hearing the news, was deeply shaken. He visited her in the hospital, paid all her medical bills, and arranged for her safe transport back to England via neutral Switzerland. Unity's return was a surreal and tragic spectacle. She arrived on a stretcher, an invalid, the brilliant, vivacious girl of her youth gone forever. The brain damage left her with the mental and emotional capacity of a child. She was placid, affectionate, but with little memory of her past or understanding of the present. The great Nazi enthusiast had become a sad, broken casualty of her own fanaticism. She would live out the rest of her days cared for by her mother Muv at their home in the Cotswolds, a constant tragic reminder of the destructive power of her obsession. For Diana, the war brought a different kind of reckoning. As prominent fascists and known associates of Hitler, she and Oswald Mosley were deemed a security risk by the British government. In the summer of 1940, under Defense Regulation 18B, which allowed for the internment of suspected Nazi sympathizers, they were arrested and imprisoned without trial. Diana, the celebrated society beauty, spent the next 3 years in the grim confines of Holloway Prison. Nancy's feelings about her sister's imprisonment were deeply conflicted. On one hand, she believed the measure was necessary for national security. She was horrified by Diana's politics and her refusal to renounce them. Yet on the other hand, this was her sister, whom she still loved. She visited Diana in prison, bringing her books and food, the two of them trying to navigate the impossible chasm that had opened between them. Meanwhile, Decca, the communist rebel, was in America with Esmond, having fled England just before the war. When the conflict began, Esmond joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and was sent to fight in Europe. In 1941, his plane was shot down over the North Sea. He was killed in action. Decca, now a young widow with a baby daughter, was left alone in a foreign country, having lost both her husband and her family to the ideological wars of her generation. For Nancy herself, the war years were a period of profound transformation. Her disastrous marriage to Peter Rod finally imploded for good. He went off to fight, leaving her alone in London during the Blitz. To do her part for the war effort and to earn a living, she took a job that would change her life. She became a shop assistant at the Haywood Hill Bookshop in Mayfair. It was here, surrounded by the books she loved, that she found a sense of purpose and independence she had never known. The shop became a social and intellectual hub for her friends, a small island of civilization and wit amidst the chaos and destruction of the war. This experience reconnected her with the world of literature and provided her with the material and the mindset that would lead to her greatest triumphs. And it was during this time, in the heart of wartime London, that she met the great love of her life. He was Colonel Gaston Pulowski, a distinguished, charming, and highly intelligent Frenchman who was a senior aide to General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces. Pulowski was everything Peter Rod had not been. He was sophisticated, politically influential, kind, and he adored Nancy, delighting in her wit and intelligence. They began a passionate affair that would become the central emotional anchor of her life. For the first time, Nancy felt truly seen, understood, and loved by a man she deeply respected. This love, combined with the crucible of her wartime experiences and the final tragic unraveling of her family drama, was forging a new woman and a new writer. The stage was set for the creation of her masterpieces. As the guns fell silent across Europe in 1945, a profound and weary quiet settled over London. The city was scarred, battered, and gray, shrouded in the dust of bombed-out buildings and the gloom of post-war austerity. For Britain, victory felt less like a celebration and more like a grim stock-taking of all that had been lost. Rations were tighter than they had been during the war. The national mood was one of exhaustion, and the once glittering world of the aristocracy seemed a faded, irrelevant relic. It was in this depleted, monochrome landscape that Nancy Mitford, against all odds, was about to create her most vibrant and enduring masterpiece. The war years, which had brought such devastation to her family, had been a period of quiet, steady alchemy for Nancy herself. Her work at the Haywood Hill bookshop had been more than just a job. It had been her salvation. It had disciplined her, given her a daily purpose, and, most importantly, it had immersed her in the world of literature in a way she had never been before. Surrounded by books and talking to customers from all walks of life, she was no longer just a witty aristocrat dabbling in writing. She was a professional woman of letters. At the same time, her passionate, intellectually fulfilling love for Gaston Pulaski had reawakened her emotionally, giving her a newfound depth and a more mature understanding of the complexities of the human heart. She had survived her disastrous marriage, the agonizing political schism of her family, and the bombs of the Blitz. The witty, often brittle young woman of the 1930s had been forged in this fire into someone altogether more formidable, more empathetic, and more profound. All of this, the heartbreak, the absurdity of her upbringing, the tragedy of her family, the joy of her great love, and the quiet wisdom gained from her years in the bookshop, was bubbling inside her, waiting for an outlet. In the final months of the war, she began to write, but this time, something was different. She wasn't just satirizing the foibles of her social set. She was excavating her own past, her own mythology, and transforming it into something universal. She was writing a book that was both a hilarious comedy of manners and a deeply poignant elegy for a lost world and a lost innocence. She was writing The Pursuit of Love. Published in the autumn of 1945, The Pursuit of Love landed in the bleak landscape of post-war Britain like a rocket flare of color, wit, and inextinguishable charm. The book was an immediate, sensational success. In a country starved of glamour, laughter, and romance, Nancy's novel was a tonic. It sold out its initial print run almost overnight, and then another and another. For the first time in her life at the age of 41, Nancy Mitford was not just a published author. She was a literary phenomenon. And crucially, she was finally financially independent. The constant, humiliating worry about money that had plagued her marriage was over. She had earned her own freedom with her own pen. The genius of The Pursuit of Love lies in its brilliant and barely disguised fictionalization of her own extraordinary family. The novel is a portrait of the eccentric Radlett family, living in their beloved but crumbling country estate, Auchinleigh. The patriarch, the terrifying and hilarious Uncle Matthew, is a thinly veiled and lovingly rendered portrait of her own father, Favre. Uncle Matthew, with his furious hatred of foreigners, his belief that sewers, a malapropism for suitors, were the bane of existence, and his ritualistic use of a hunting horn to summon his children, was Favre brought to life on the page. His terrifying rages somehow rendered comical and even endearing through the filter of nostalgic love. The chaotic brood of Radlett children were, of course, the Mitfords themselves, and the story is narrated by the calm, observant Fanny Logan, a character who closely resembles Nancy's own role as the watchful chronicler of her family's madness. But the heart of the novel is the wild, beautiful, and hopelessly romantic Linda Radlett, a character who pursues true love with a passionate, often disastrous single-mindedness. Linda is a composite of the Mitford sisters' most romantic and reckless traits, a tribute to the passionate spirit that Nancy both admired and feared. The book follows Linda's chaotic love life, from her stuffy first marriage to a Tory politician, to her dalliance with a communist, and finally to her finding true happiness in wartime Paris with a suave and loving Frenchman named Fabrice de Sauveterre, a character transparently based on Gaston Pulowski. What made the novel so powerful was its unique blend of tones. It is one of the funniest books ever written in English, filled with iconic scenes and unforgettable one-liners. Yet, beneath the sparkling surface is a deep vein of melancholy and tragedy. It is a story about the constraints placed upon women in a patriarchal world, about the often painful difference between romantic ideals and the messy reality of relationships, and about the brutal way that history, in the form of the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, intrudes upon and destroys private happiness. Its tragic ending, in which Linda dies in childbirth just as she has found her great love, is a moment of profound and unexpected pathos. The book captured the mood of a generation that had lived through unimaginable loss but was desperate to remember how to laugh and love again. It was a love letter to a bygone era and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Following the phenomenal success of her novel, Nancy's life was transformed. She was now a celebrated public figure, a literary celebrity. But England, in the late 1940s, felt increasingly constraining. The austerity, the high taxes, and the prevailing socialist ethos of the new Labour government were anathema to her. But more than that, England was filled with too many ghosts: the ghost of her failed marriage, the painful notoriety of her family name, and most importantly, Gaston Pulowski was in France. In 1946, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She moved to Paris. It was both an escape and a homecoming. She felt an immediate and profound affinity for French culture, its emphasis on style, its intellectual rigor, its appreciation for the art of conversation, and its unsentimental, pragmatic approach to life and love. She threw herself into her new life with gusto, perfecting her French, decorating her elegant apartment on the Rue Monsieur, and cultivating a new circle of sophisticated French friends, including the designer Christian Dior and the composer Francis Poulenc. In Paris, she was not just one of the scandalous Mitford sisters. She was a respected author and a celebrated wit in her own right. She had found her spiritual home. Her life in Paris revolved to a large extent around her relationship with the Colonel, as she affectionately called Pulowski. He was now a prominent Gaullist politician, a key figure in the post-war French government. Their affair continued, a source of immense happiness and intellectual companionship for Nancy. He was her guide to the intricacies of French politics and culture, and she was his brilliant, amusing English confidant. Their time together was filled with witty conversation, shared intellectual passions, and a deep, abiding affection. However, the relationship was permanently shadowed by a painful reality. Pulowski was married, and he would never get a divorce. His wife, a Polish heiress, was an invalid, and for a combination of reasons, Catholicism, political ambition, and a certain sense of duty, he remained with her. This meant that Nancy's role in his life was necessarily a semi-secret one. She was his mistress, a position she accepted with a mixture of pragmatism and deep private sorrow. Her life was often a waiting game, waiting for his telephone calls, for his brief visits between political appointments, for the stolen weeks they could spend together on holiday. Her letters from this period reveal the profound emotional conflict at the heart of her Parisian happiness. They are filled with declarations of her deep and total love for him, but also with moments of intense loneliness and frustration. She decorated her apartment to his taste, learned to cook the dishes he liked, and structured her entire existence around his convenience. She once wrote to her sister Diana, "One thing is sad, which is that I am a homeless person, and shall be so now forever, I suppose." It was a poignant admission. Despite the elegance of her Parisian life and the brilliance of her literary career, she lacked the one thing she perhaps secretly craved most: the simple security of a shared home, the acknowledged status of a wife. This unfulfilled longing, this permanent state of emotional waiting, became the quiet, melancholy bass note playing beneath the sparkling melody of her life in France. Fueled by her new life and experiences, she continued to write. In 1949, she published Love in a Cold Climate, a companion piece to The Pursuit of Love. If the first book was a warm, nostalgic look at the pursuit of romantic passion, the second was a cooler, more bitingly satirical examination of the English aristocracy's other great obsession, the pursuit of a good match. It was another resounding success, cementing her reputation as the undisputed queen of the comedy of manners. She had found her voice, and the world was clamoring to hear it. Nancy had become more than just a successful novelist. She had become an arbiter of taste, an expert on the intricate, often invisible codes of the English upper class. It was this reputation that led, in the mid-1950s, to the greatest controversy of her career, a national firestorm ignited by two little letters, you and non-you. The saga began in 1954 when a nerdy linguistics professor at the University of Birmingham, Alan S. C. Ross, published a dry, scholarly article on the linguistic markers of the English upper class. In it, he coined the terms you for upper class and non-you for not upper class, to differentiate between the vocabulary and speech patterns of the aristocracy and those of the aspiring middle classes. Nancy, always fascinated by the subtle indicators of class, read the article with delight. Recognizing its potential for mischief and social commentary, she decided to popularize Ross's findings. In 1956, she edited a book of essays called Noblesse Oblige, an inquiry into the identifiable characteristics of the English aristocracy. She commissioned Ross to write a version of his article for it, and then she penned her own, much wittier and more provocative essay on the subject, entitled The English Aristocracy. It was this essay that lit the fuse. With a series of brilliantly chosen and often hilarious examples, Nancy laid bare the secret linguistic tripwires of the English class system. She explained that it was hopelessly non-you to say toilet. A you speaker would say lavatory or loo. It was non-you to have a serviette at the dinner table. You folk had napkins. Wealthy was non-you, rich was you, sweet was non-you, pudding was you. The list went on. A devastatingly accurate and often seemingly arbitrary catalog of words that could instantly betray one's social origins. She was, in essence, providing a field guide to English snobbery, and the English public went absolutely wild for it. The you and non-you debate exploded into a national obsession. Newspapers were flooded with letters to the editor, either furiously denouncing Nancy as an insufferable snob or gleefully providing their own examples of you and non-you behavior. People at dinner parties across the country began self-consciously correcting their vocabulary. The controversy tapped into a deep well of anxiety about class that simmered just beneath the surface of British society. In the post-war era, with its promise of a more egalitarian future, Nancy's essay was a mischievous and, to many, an unwelcome reminder that the old class divisions were alive and well. policed by a secret code to which only a select few had the key. The debate raged for months. Was Nancy Mitford a serious social commentator, or was she simply a privileged aristocrat laughing at the social aspirations of the middle class? Was she reinforcing a rigid and unfair class system, or was she satirizing it? The truth, as with most things Nancy did, was probably somewhere in between. She was certainly amused by the absurdities of social climbing, but she was also a keen and accurate observer. She wasn't inventing these rules. She was merely reporting on them with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. The furor both delighted and slightly alarmed her. She had intended to write a light-hearted piece of social observation, and she had inadvertently started a national conversation about the very soul of English society. The controversy cemented her public image as the ultimate insider, the witty, elegant, and slightly terrifying authority on how the upper crust lived, spoke, and thought. She had come a long way from the insecure girl desperate for a husband. She was now a famous, successful, and formidable woman of letters, living a glamorous life in Paris, loved by a powerful man and capable of sending her home country into a collective tizzy with a single essay. She was at the absolute pinnacle of her fame and influence. By the mid-1950s, Nancy Mitford had achieved a level of success that would have been unimaginable to the young woman weeping over Hamish Street, Claire Erskine, 2 decades earlier. She was no longer just an author. She was a cultural institution. Her life in Paris was a portrait of sophisticated, self-made elegance, a world away from the chaotic, drafty country houses of her youth. The sensational success of her 2 great novels and the nationwide furor over you and non-you had made her a household name. She was the witty, sharp-tongued, and impeccably stylish queen of expatriate literary society. Her pronouncements on taste and manners breathlessly reported in the press. She had, by all accounts, arrived. And yet, for a mind as restless and inquisitive as Nancy's, arrival is never a final destination. A subtle shift was beginning to occur, both in the world around her and within herself. The aristocratic society that had been the raw material for her brilliant satire was rapidly changing, fading into a new, less certain post-war world. The great country houses were being sold off, death duties were crippling the old families, and the rigid class structures she had so expertly dissected were beginning to dissolve. What does a satirist do when her target begins to vanish? Furthermore, there was a personal, intellectual restlessness gnawing at her. Her lifelong insecurity about her lack of a university education had never entirely disappeared. While she was celebrated for her witty novels, she yearned for a different kind of intellectual validation. She wanted to prove, perhaps to the world, but mostly to herself, that she was more than just a clever comedian of manners. She was a serious intellect, a scholar capable of rigorous, demanding work. The sharp, observant eye she had trained on the drawing rooms of London and Oxfordshire now began to turn towards the grand and dramatic tapestry of the past. She decided to stop writing novels about her own world and to start chronicling the lives of figures from the one she felt a deeper spiritual kinship with, the glorious, civilized, and intellectually dazzling world of 18th century France. Her first foray into this new genre was Madame de Pompadour, published in 1954. It was a subject that suited her perfectly. The Marquise de Pompadour was not just the beautiful mistress of King Louis XV. She was a woman of immense intelligence, taste, and political influence, a commoner who had risen to become the most powerful woman in France, a formidable patron of the arts, and a key player in the complex game of court politics. In Pompadour, Nancy found a kindred spirit, a woman who used her wit, charm, and intellect to navigate and dominate a world ruled by men. Nancy's approach to biography was revolutionary for its time. She rejected the dry, dusty academic style that was then in vogue. Instead, she brought her novelist's toolkit to the task. She focused on character, on personality, on the gossip and human drama that she knew were the real engines of history. She had an uncanny ability to read historical documents, letters, diaries, memoirs, and resurrect the living, breathing people behind them. She wrote history as if it were a particularly juicy and engrossing novel. She spent countless hours engaged in meticulous, painstaking research in the archives at Versailles, digging up obscure details and forgotten anecdotes that brought the period to life. The resulting book was a triumph. It was scholarly, packed with historical detail, yet it read with the pace and sparkle of her best fiction. The public adored it, and even most critics were charmed by her fresh, accessible approach. She had successfully reinvented herself. This new career path also deepened her connection to her adopted country. It gave her a legitimate reason to immerse herself in French history and culture, to spend her days in the magnificent libraries and palaces that she loved. Her life settled into a comfortable and productive rhythm. She decided to leave the bustle of central Paris for the quieter, more elegant surroundings of Versailles itself, moving into a charming house at No. 7 Rue d'Artois. Here, she created a perfect Anglophile version of a French life. Her days were disciplined. She would write all morning, a strict, self-imposed regimen that was the bedrock of her success. In the afternoons, she would tend to her beloved garden, a passion that brought her immense peace and satisfaction, or browse the local markets. Her evenings were for her friends, for witty, lively dinner parties, and, whenever possible, for the Colonel. Gaston Pulowski remained the sun around which her entire emotional universe orbited. As he rose through the ranks of the French government, becoming a powerful minister under President de Gaulle, his time became ever more precious and his public life more demanding. Yet their bond remained as strong as ever. Her house in Versailles became their sanctuary, a private world where he could escape the pressures of politics, and she could enjoy the simple domestic happiness of being with the man she loved. She catered to his every need, learning his tastes, running her household for his comfort, and providing a constant, stable backdrop to his turbulent public life. But the quiet tragedy of their situation also became more entrenched with time. The years passed. They grew older together. The faint, youthful hope that he might one day be free to marry her slowly, almost imperceptibly, faded into a resigned acceptance of the status quo. She was now in her 50s, a celebrated author, but in the most important area of her life, she was still a woman waiting. She poured her unfulfilled maternal longings into her relationships with her many nieces and nephews, particularly the children of her youngest sister, Debo, the Duchess of Devonshire. She was a magical, witty, and adored aunt, a stable and amusing presence in their lives. But the children she had so desperately wanted for herself never came. A stillbirth and several miscarriages in her younger years had left that part of her life barren. This private sorrow, combined with the permanent ambiguity of her relationship with Gaston, cast a subtle but persistent shadow over her otherwise glittering success. Her next biography, Voltaire in Love, 1957, was another exploration of the themes that fascinated her. It chronicled the long, tempestuous, and intellectually dazzling love affair between the great philosopher Voltaire and the brilliant scientist Émilie du Châtelet. Again, she was drawn to the story of a powerful, unconventional intellectual partnership, a relationship of equals that defied social norms. The book was another critical and commercial success, solidifying her reputation as a first-rate popular historian. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Nancy's life in Versailles continued in its established pattern. But the world was changing. Her own family, the source of so much drama and inspiration, was also entering a new, quieter phase. The fierce political passions that had once torn them apart had cooled with time and the harsh realities of history. Decca was a successful writer in America. Her communism mellowed into a more general radical chic. Diana, having served her time in prison, was living a secluded life in France with Mosley, ostracized by many but still unrepentant, a figure of tragic, defiant glamour. The old wounds between the sisters began to heal, replaced by a renewed sense of familial loyalty. Nancy and Diana, in particular, re-established their close bond, corresponding constantly and visiting each other. The deep foundational love of sisterhood proved in the end to be more resilient than the ideologies that had once threatened to destroy it. Nancy's greatest popular success as a biographer was still to come. In 1966, she published The Sun King, a magnificent, lavishly illustrated account of the life and court of Louis XIV at Versailles. The book was a global bestseller. Nancy's ability to conjure the sheer spectacle, the intricate etiquette, and the human drama of the most glorious court in European history was unparalleled. She made history not just accessible, but utterly glamorous. The book was perfectly timed, catching a wave of public fascination with historical glamour, and it cemented her status as one of an elite group of writers who could command huge international sales. She was now in her 60s, a grande dame of the literary world, respected, wealthy, and secure in her reputation. She had built a life for herself in France that was, by any measure, a triumph. And then, in 1969, the carefully constructed emotional edifice of that life was shattered by a single devastating blow. Gaston Pawlowski's invalid wife, who had been the official, if unseen, reason for his inability to marry Nancy for over 2 decades, finally died. For a fleeting moment, a door that had been closed for a lifetime seemed to creak open. After more than 25 years of devoted, patient love, was it possible that she and her colonel could finally be together, properly and publicly? But the hope, if she even allowed herself to feel it, was almost instantly extinguished. Within months of his wife's death, Gaston Pawlowski announced his engagement not to Nancy, but to another woman, Hélène Violette de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Duchesse de Sagan, a wealthy and well-connected aristocrat from his own French social world. The news was a profound and catastrophic shock. It was the ultimate final heartbreak, a rejection so deep and so public that it seemed to negate her entire adult life. She had dedicated herself to him, structured her existence around him, waited for him, only to be cast aside at the final moment for a more suitable, more conventional French duchess. Her friends rallied around her, but her devastation was immense. In her letters, the witty, stoic mask finally slipped, revealing a woman utterly broken by grief. To her sister Diana, she wrote with raw simplicity, "It's all too sad, and I can't write about it." The pain was too deep for words, even for a woman who had made words her life. She had faced family scandal, war, and public controversy with her wit and courage intact. But this quiet, personal betrayal was the wound from which she would never fully recover. She tried to bury her pain in work, throwing herself into her final major biography, A Study of Frederick the Great, 1970. But the joy was gone. A weariness began to creep into her life, a sense of profound emotional exhaustion. And soon, it was accompanied by a physical ailment, a strange and persistent pain that at first she tried to ignore, but which would grow to consume the final years of her life. It began subtly, an ache in her side, a profound fatigue that she couldn't shake. She, who had always been so energetic, found herself struggling to get through her days. She began a long, frustrating, and demoralizing round of visits to doctors in both France and England. They were baffled. They ran endless tests, offered conflicting diagnoses, a slipped disc, rheumatism, a pulled muscle, and prescribed treatments that did nothing to alleviate her suffering. The pain grew worse, becoming a constant, gnawing presence. For a woman whose greatest tool was her sharp, clear mind, the inability to get a straight answer, to name her enemy, was a particular kind of torture. For 2 years, this agonizing uncertainty continued. She became progressively weaker, the pain often so intense that she was confined to her bed. Yet through it all, her spirit, her indomitable Mitford spirit, refused to be extinguished. Her letters from this period are an extraordinary testament to her courage and her enduring sense of the absurd. She would describe her ailments in grimly hilarious detail, turning her own suffering into a kind of black comedy. She still saw friends when she could, still kept up with gossip, and still reserved her most ferocious energy for maintaining her appearance for Gaston's infrequent visits, determined not to let him see the extent of her decay. Finally, in 1972, after a particularly grueling series of tests in London, the doctors were able to give her a definitive diagnosis. It was Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system. In a way, the certainty was a relief. She at last knew the name of her foe. But the prognosis was grim, and the treatment would be brutal. She was about to enter the final, most difficult chapter of her life, a battle not against social conventions or difficult family members, but against her own body. The celebrated writer who had chronicled the lives of kings and courtesans was now forced to chronicle her own slow, painful decline. The diagnosis of Hodgkin's lymphoma, while a relief from the agony of uncertainty, was also a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Nancy Mitford, a woman who had spent her life wielding her sharp, precise intellect to control her world, was now forced into a brutal, intimate, and ultimately losing battle with the chaos inside her own body. The final years of her life, from 1972 until her death in the summer of 1973, were a testament to the extraordinary courage, indomitable wit, and profound suffering that had always coexisted just beneath the glittering surface of her public persona. She faced her end, not with self-pity, but with the same black humor, stoicism, and fierce, unsentimental clarity that had defined her from the very beginning. The treatment regimen was savage. The chemotherapy and radiation of the early 1970s were blunt, unforgiving instruments, and they ravaged her already frail body. She was constantly sick, racked with pain, and overcome by a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical weight. The elegant, stylish woman who had once been a fixture in the salons of Paris and the country houses of England was now gaunt and weak, her life reduced to the four walls of her beloved house in Versailles. Yet her mind remained as sharp and ferocious as ever. Her letters from this period are among the most remarkable documents of her life, a running commentary on her own decline that is at once heartbreaking and hilariously funny. She wrote to her friends and family with a novelist's eye for detail, describing the indignities of her illness with a kind of grim, detached amusement. She referred to the agonizing pain as the shriekers, and wrote about her treatments as if they were a particularly tedious and badly managed social engagement. To her old friend, Evelyn Waugh, she complained wittily about the incompetence of her doctors and the absurdity of her situation. This was her armor. Wit had always been her shield against the pains of the world, against her father's rages, her mother's neglect, her lover's infidelity. And she refused to lay it down now, even in the face of death itself. It was her final act of defiance, a refusal to be defined by her suffering. In these last difficult months, the deep, complicated, but ultimately unbreakable bonds of sisterhood reasserted themselves. Her sisters, particularly Diana and Debo, rallied to her side. Debo, the Duchess of Devonshire, would come from England, bringing with her a dose of down-to-earth practicality and cheer, managing the household, and providing a comforting, no-nonsense presence. Diana, her great antagonist and confidant, would travel from her home nearby in France to sit with her for hours. The fierce political divisions that had once defined their relationship now seemed to matter very little. They were no longer fascist and anti-fascist. They were simply sisters, bound by a shared history and a deep, abiding love. They would talk for hours, not about politics, but about the things that had always connected them: books, gossip, their shared memories of their mad, unforgettable childhood at Swinbrook. In Nancy's final months, the Mitford tribe, so long fractured, came together to protect one of its own. The one figure who remained a source of both comfort and exquisite pain was Gaston Pulowski. He did visit, but his visits were often brief, fitted in between his still demanding political and social obligations. For Nancy, lying in her bed, racked with pain and waiting for him, his presence was a bittersweet reminder of all she had loved and all she had lost. She would summon her last reserves of energy for his appearances, insisting on having her hair done and putting on a touch of makeup, a final, poignant performance for the man who was the great, unresolved love of her life. But his inability, even at the end, to offer her his full, uncomplicated devotion was the final confirmation of their story's tragic arc. A friend who was with her after one of his visits recalled her turning her head to the wall and weeping with a quiet, inconsolable despair. The great love had, in the final analysis, failed her. As the spring of 1973 turned to summer, Nancy knew the end was near. She was in almost constant pain, but she adamantly refused to leave her home. She would die here, in her beloved house in Versailles, surrounded by her books, her garden, and the beautiful objects she had spent a lifetime collecting. On the 30th of June, 1973, with her sister Diana by her side, Nancy Mitford finally died. She was 68 years old. The sharpest, funniest, and most distinctive voice of her generation had fallen silent. The obituaries that followed were a testament to the unique place she held in the cultural landscape. She was remembered as a brilliant novelist, a groundbreaking biographer, and a peerless wit. But to truly understand Nancy Mitford's legacy, we must look beyond the simple facts of her life and career and examine the profound and lasting impact she had on literature and our understanding of an entire social epoch. As a biographer, she forged a new path for popular history. At a time when historical writing was often the preserve of academics, she demonstrated that it could be accessible, entertaining, and character-driven without sacrificing intellectual rigor. Her biographies of Madame de Pompadour and Louis XIV brought 18th century France to life for millions of readers, proving that history was not just a collection of dates and facts, but a thrilling human drama filled with love, ambition, and folly. She approached her historical subjects with the same psychological insight and wit she applied to her fictional characters, and, in doing so, she created a new genre that countless authors have since emulated. But perhaps Nancy's most profound and complex legacy is as the official myth maker of the Mitford family itself. Without her, the story of her family would be a scattered collection of sensational headlines: the Nazi sympathizing sisters, the communist rebel. Nancy, through her novels and her voluminous correspondence, was the one who wove these disparate, dramatic threads into a coherent, compelling, and enduring family saga. She was the one who curated the legend. She understood with a novelist's instinct that her family was a story too good not to be told, and she was the only one who could tell it with the necessary blend of inside knowledge, critical distance, and deep, albeit often exasperated, love. She turned the pain, chaos, and absurdity of her own life into timeless art. In the end, the story of Nancy Mitford is a story of survival and transformation. It is the story of a woman born into a world of immense privilege, but also profound emotional and intellectual constraint, who used her one great gift, her voice, to carve out a life of independence and meaning. She navigated the treacherous waters of her extraordinary family, the disappointments of love, and the ravages of illness, with a resilience that was nothing short of heroic. The central paradox of her life was the chasm between her public persona and her private self. The glittering, confident, sometimes intimidating wit on the outside, and the vulnerable, lonely, and deeply feeling heart within. Her life is a testament to the power of observation, the importance of laughter, and the idea that the best response to the absurdity of the human condition is to capture it on the page with as much style and honesty as possible. She was a woman who felt things deeply, but who chose to express her deepest feelings through the sophisticated, glittering armor of comedy. She taught us that a keen eye and a sharp wit are not just tools for entertainment. They are essential tools for survival. The swan of a pen, as she was so aptly called, may have completed its journey, but the elegant, indelible ripples it left behind continue to spread, a lasting tribute to one of the most remarkable literary voices of all time.